Often, if a wrestler is in danger of getting stale and they want to mix up their act a little, one of the easiest ways they can do this is by changing up their look. After all, wrestling is a visual form of entertainment, and so a new appearance can make the world of difference when it comes to making someone feel fresh again. But what are the biggest examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with one of the most dramatic makeovers in WWE history, JBL. Why was this one so dramatic? Well, because only the week prior to his debut under this new guise, Bradshaw was still being portrayed as the hard-drinking, ass-kicking Texan who served as one half of the APA alongside Ron Simmons. So to see him come out just 7 days later with a cowboy hat, suit, and limo felt pretty jarring then, especially when he picked up a mic and it became apparent this new gimmick was less Stan Hansen and more J.R. Ewing from Dallas. That's right, now the Texan was portraying a business mogul that had gotten rich manipulating the stock market and who was now lording his wealth over the entire WWE fan base. And as it happened, this would actually be pretty close to his actual personality, closer even than Bradshaw had been, as John Layfield was in real life a bit of a financial expert. Still, while to him this might have felt more natural, to fans it took some getting used to at first. But once they had a chance to acclimatize to the new character, they got all in JBL as a heel. So much so that just a few months later, Vince McMahon would make the decision to go all the way with him by having him beat Eddie Guerrero for the WWE title. After that, the former Acolyte was a made man for life, a reality which would probably never have come to pass had he remained in his old bar-brawling gimmick. That's right, in terms of makeovers, this one has to rank right there among the most successful, as it took a mid-carder and dragged him all the way to the top of the card in record time. Of course, not everyone who has a makeover uses this to get to the top of the card. No, sometimes that person is there already. Why would they want to change things up at all then? Well, when it comes to Brock Lesnar, he probably just got bored of being the clean-shaven, short-haired guy after a while. But then this new style suited Brock, as in reality he's always like a modern-day Viking. Hell, whenever he's not wrestling, he can probably be found out somewhere in the wilderness of Saskatchewan hunting or chopping trees. So it only makes sense that in his personal time, he'd grow out his hair and beard a lot more, as this no doubt keeps him warm while he's stalking his prey. That said, even if this is his reality back home in Canada, whenever the former UFC heavyweight champion hit a WWE ring prior to 2021, he'd always have that same look. We wouldn't go as far as to call it clean cut exactly, but it was certainly tamer than it would have been while he was off the clock. This all changed as the new decade rolled around, however, because apparently growing tired of shaving at that point, Lesnar made his return to WWE with an all-new beard and long hair combo, a look which somehow made him even tougher. And the reason it made him tougher was because now it felt like we were finally getting the big man in his truest form, with that being a force of nature who could not be controlled by anything or anyone. Hell, if you need any evidence this is a different, altogether more dangerous Brock to the one we've seen before, you only have to look at the fact that over the last 3 years, he's already won the WWE title on 2 more occasions. And on top of that, he's also demolished opponents such as Big E, Bobby Lashley, and Cody Rhodes. One person we never really got to see him mix it up with during this incarnation though was our next subject. And the reason he's our next subject is because, true to his reputation for being creatively brilliant, Wyndham Rotunda was able to take a lower card gimmick like Husky Harris and transform it into the legendary Bray Wyatt. Yes, when Harris was first introduced to WWE fans in 2010 as the newest member of the Nexus, few could have foreseen how far he would go in the years following. And that was because his original incarnation was about as bland could be. Seriously, there was nothing memorable at all about the Florida native here. That said, this would all change once he returned to Florida Championship Wrestling in 2011, and there was allowed to let his creativity go wild. What would the end result of this creative free flow be? One of the greatest gimmicks of the modern era. That's right, after growing his hair and beard out and taking on a wardrobe similar to Max Cady and Cape Fear, Husky Harris morphed into Bray Wyatt, a Bayou cult leader who hypnotized his followers to such a degree that they were more than happy to follow him to the ends of the earth and back. And when we talk about his followers here, we're not just talking about Luke Harper, Eric Rowan, and Braun Strowman. No, we're talking about the fans of WWE, because despite debuting as a heel, by the time WrestleMania 30 came around in 2014, whole stadiums of people would be lifting their torches and cell phones in the air to symbolically show that they'd chosen to follow the Buzzards. It's just a shame that poor booking would end up hobbling this great character in the long run then, forcing Bray to transform himself 2 more times over the course of his career. once when he morphed into The Fiend in 2019, and then again when he introduced live crowds to the even more mysterious Uncle Howdy in 2022. And even if his tragic death in 2023 means we'll never get to see the full scale of what he had planned for that latter character, his legacy as one of the greatest creative minds the industry had ever seen will continue on. Hell, you could make a solid argument he's the most creative figure the world of wrestling has produced since back during the days of the 90s when Scott Levy was dumping the gimmick of Johnny Polo and instead becoming the iconic Raven. What made this change so great? Well, like with the upgrade of Husky Harris to Bray Wyatt, it took someone who was on a path towards being a career jobber and skyrocketed them to the top of the card in one fell swoop. But then, what else could you expect from the former ECW World Champion, as even during his first run with WWF in 1993 and 1994, he'd always been known to be someone who had a particularly great mind for the business. The only problem back then, though, was that he didn't get a chance to show this, as he was saddled with the terrible character of Johnny Polo, a spoiled rich kid who screamed bad 90s New York gimmick. Hell, so go nowhere was this one. Levy barely even got a chance to wrestle while portraying it. No, despite being more than capable of handling himself in the ring, he'd only really be used as a manager and occasional commentator for the most part. Thank God he got a chance to redeem himself then when in 1995 he jumped ship to ECW, and there developed the new character of Raven, a misanthropic grunge kid who quickly connected with audiences in a major way. And the reason he connected with them so much was because he was pretty much one of them, someone who felt he had a lot more to offer than he'd been given the chance to show, and as a result of this, had grown bitter and resentful of others around him. Yes, despite clearly being portrayed as the heel, something about the Raven character clicked with the ECW fanbase in such a way that he often felt more popular than many of the supposed babyfaces there. But then we suppose that's just a testament to how great of a change in both look and character this was, and how savvy Scott Levy was when it came to understanding his audience. So popular and successful was Raven, in fact, that even now, almost 3 decades on, he still occasionally appears in-ring at places like Impact or Major League Wrestling. But for as much credit as the Philadelphia native deserves for his longevity, even he may pale in comparison to the longevity our next subject has had. Of course, part of the reason for this is because Kane understood when to change things up by removing his mask. Yes, this one simple decision was enough to give the Big Red Machine a whole new lease on life right when he needed it the most. After all, while the Kane gimmick was one of the best of its era and had seen Glenn Jacobs find huge levels of success during the late 90s and early 2000s, come 2002, it was undeniably starting to grow a little long in the tooth. Luckily then, there was one obvious thing that could be done to revitalize it at this point, and that was for the big man to remove his mask and show his face to the world for the first time. Sure, the creative team would have to explain why he never had the scars which supposedly caused him to hide his visage in the first place, but that proved easy enough to do when they told us these scars were psychological rather than physical. And once fans understood this, it left Kane free to return to being the full-blown horror movie monster he'd been when he first came into the company, back before his character had been softened into more of an unlikely hero to outcasts everywhere. That's right, now that his mask was off, there was no more fighting for the people on the Big Red Machine's mind. No, all he wanted to do at this point was to destroy every babyface in his path and make anyone who ever wronged him in the past suffer greatly. Sure, as time went on, even this would grow a little stale, but then that was to be expected as nothing can be fresh and exciting forever. That said, when this happened, all Kane had to do was put the mask back on once more, and in the process, feel fresh all over again. Honestly, he could probably keep doing this every few years until the end of time at this point, and it would have the same effect as if there's one thing we've learned from WWE fans over the years, it's that they'll always get behind him as long as they're given even the smallest reason to do so. And he's not the only performer who removed and then put a mask back on again that fans never got bored of cheering for. How can we be confident of this? Well, because we've seen the way people cheer for Rey Mysterio even this many decades into his career. It doesn't matter if we're talking about his early days in AAA and ECW, his more well-known runs in both WCW and WWE, or his mid-2010s excursion into the indie scene where he performed for promotions like Lucha Underground. Audiences have always loved the California native no matter what. One period of time which tested this love, however, came in 1998, as it was then that, while working for WCW, Ray was booked to lose his iconic mask after he and Conan were defeated by Scott Hall and Kevin Nash in a tag bout at that February Super Brawl 9. Why was Ray unmasked here? Was it a case that fans were growing tired of his act and so he needed to freshen things up a little bit? Not even close. Hell, fans were just as into him as they ever had been. The problem, as it turned out, was that then company chief Eric Bischoff felt the lucha legend wouldn't be able to get over with American audiences on a larger level if his face was hidden from view. So in order to rectify this, he chose to reveal that face. That's right, rather than respect the proud history of luchadors and their masks, as well as make a small fortune off of selling replicas to kids in the audience, WCW botched things majorly when he turned Rey into just another cruiserweight, robbing him of so much of the mystique he had when he was a superhero who could have been anyone. But thankfully this error would be rectified in the end, as once WCW folded in 2001, the future WWE champion went to the Lucha Council in Mexico and asked for their permission to put his mask back on, with this being something they ultimately granted him. So it was then that when he joined WWE a year later, Rey's face was once more hidden from view, and a whole new audience who knew nothing of him prior to that got a chance to experience the special aura he created when he was allowed to be a figure of ambiguity. And thank God this happened, because for as great as he is, it's hard to imagine him being as successful in New York if he was being seen as being on the same level as other cruiserweights such as Billy Kidman or Chavo Guerrero back when he debuted with the promotion. Sure, you could argue that he would have become the top guy he became anyway, as the cream always rises to the top, but then sometimes the cream needs a little help getting there. And nowhere is this more evident than in the case of our next subject. Who are we talking about here? Why, the man who went from being Stunning Steve to a bald Texas rattlesnake over the course of just a few years, none other than Stone Cold Steve Austin. Of course, Austin was still over when he was working for WCW either as a solo act, tagging with Brian Pillman, or serving as a member of Paul Heyman's Dangerous Alliance, but the level he was at was nothing compared to where he'd find himself come the late 90s. And while you can't attribute all this to the fact that he changed his look, you can't deny that Stone Cold's battles with Vince McMahon and the rest of the corporation each and every week would have felt a lot less cool somehow if he still had his long, flowing blonde hair. No, being the bald badass was integral to what made Steve Austin who he was, just as the fact that he dressed only in basic black gear was integral to that idea as well. After all, if you're going to be a man of the people, then being the apparent pretty boy of the World Championship Wrestling mid-card is not the best way to go about this. But if you shave your head, start pounding some beers, and trash talk everyone in your vicinity, then folks are going to think you've got something special pretty quickly. And that's exactly what happened once 1996 came around and the Rattlesnake truly began his ascent towards the main event scene. Hell, you could argue that on account of how big of a star he became, this, and not JBL, is the best makeover in wrestling history. It's certainly the one which drew the most money and got the most eyeballs watching every Monday night, and while those fans were watching religiously during the heights of the Attitude Era, they'd also be treated to a mid-card made up of figures like our next subject, the man who went from mid-90s MTV rapper to what appeared to be a demonic figure in only a few short years. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Viscera? Seriously, if things hadn't worked out in the ring for Nelson Frazier, then he could have had a nice second career as a villain in a horror series. And that's because with his leather matrix getup and bleached blonde mohawk, he certainly looked the part. Prior to this, however, he'd been a very different performer, as back in the mid-90s, rather than play the role of one of The Undertaker's demonic minions, he was instead being cast as one half of Men on a Mission, a rap duo who took all their cues from the stylings of the Fresh Prince and Jazzy Jeff. And this meant no bad language then, only positivity, an attitude which worked for him for a while, up until the point he turned heel in 1995, but this heel turn was nothing compared to the one the big man would be part of years later, as, while the new generation was a lot more cartoonish in its nature, the Attitude Era was all about being as edgy as possible. And that meant Mabel simply couldn't work anymore during such a period, so that's why he became Viscera in 1999 and completely reinvigorated his career in the process. Sure, he wouldn't exactly be returning to the main event scene at the time, but at least he had a regular spot on shows as part of the Ministry of Darkness. And when the Ministry fell later that year, he'd continue on with the gimmick for a while yet, with it later morphing into even newer forms such as the World's Largest Love Machine and Big Daddy V. Tragically though, with the North Carolina native dying of a heart attack in 2014, it means we'll never get to see him in the ring once more in the modern day, where he'd likely fit right in with the likes of the Judgment Day. One wrestler who may return to WWE eventually though is a woman who was fired last year, that being Mandy Rose. Before that happened though, the Westchester native was on the run of her career as the NXT Women's Champion and leader of Toxic Attraction, basically 2.0's version of Mean Girls. And the reason she stood out so much here was because she was willing to completely change her look in doing so. That's right, now rather than being the blonde bombshell and object of desire for the likes of Otis she had been previously, she'd adopt an all-new dark-haired look, which gave her the fresh coat of paint required to help her get over as a main event player on the developmental brand. Seriously, if you ever needed proof that a simple thing like a bottle of hair dye could have such a massive impact on the way a wrestler is perceived by not only management, but the audience watching, then this is all the evidence required right here. Sure, it's not as if she'd suddenly became Io Sky or Charlotte Flair in the ring, but Mandy did notably improve during her time in NXT. Of course, with her now gone from WWE, there's every chance she'll continue to change her look up even more from time to time. However, we doubt any further transformations she'll make in the future could compare to the change our next subject went through when he went from Festus to Luke Gallows. Don't remember Festus? Well, we wouldn't blame you if you didn't, because it wasn't exactly the greatest gimmick in the world. All it was, in fact, was a seemingly mentally challenged man who only came to life as a killing machine whenever the bell rang to signify the start of a match. So clearly, this drooling, skullet-wearing character wasn't going to work out for the future multiple-time tag team champion in the long run then. And that's why it's just as well he got a dramatic revamp when in 2009 he joined up with CM Punk's Straight Edge Society. Why was this so significant? Well, because at that point, the Maryland native's kayfabe history was rewritten to suggest he was never mentally challenged at all, and instead, only someone lost in a haze of drug addiction. So when the voice of the voiceless got him clean, he no longer acted like that, and as if this weren't enough, he was now able to shave his head completely and grow out his beard too. Obviously then, this was the best thing which could have happened to his career because even after the Straight Edge Society split the following year, Gallows was able to use his new gimmick to have an excellent career in both Japan and Impact Wrestling. And once that was over, he'd return to WWE again in 2016 along with Carl Anderson, as there, the two set about achieving their goal of winning more tag team gold. Yes, the Good Brothers are a truly underrated tag team, considering their global accomplishments. But would Gallows have been able to achieve everything he did if he were still Festus? It's unlikely, but then that just goes to show how important a change in look can be for a performer from time to time, as it gives them a whole new persona to play with.